Just a few final thoughts on 2 Peter. I think if Peter had one lesson that he would want us to all learn and to walk away from, it would be, how do you combat false teaching? So I'm hoping somebody in the class can answer that. What is the number one combatant to false teaching? Study the Bible, absolutely. Grow in the grace and the knowledge of Jesus Christ, absolutely. That's what Peter talked about there. Get in the Word and get to studying. And I think this final teaching for Peter kind of brings all this full circle. Peter began this by teaching that God's divine power has given us everything we need for a life of godliness. You don't need what false teachers are offering. You don't need it. We have everything we need. Be growing Christians. We've got everything we need. And this growing in knowledge and growing in grace, it should cause a change in our character. It should cause a change in who we are and the kind of people we are. If it's not changing our lives, there's no value in it. It needs to change us. That's what Peter's telling us. Amazing, amazing, amazing words from this man who was getting ready to die. So I think we'll leave 2 Peter there with kind of those thoughts. So before we get into 1 John, Brad, you care to lead us in the word of prayer?
Heavenly Father God, we're so thankful for this day you've given us, the ability you bless us always to come out to your symbol, to worship you, Lord. Pray we'll forget about the cares and the thoughts of the world for just a few moments and focus on you, get there and get the things that he's prepared. Help us to be engaged to the teachings of John. Lord, be with all the teachers who are leading the minds of the children and high school kids and everybody here this morning. Pray that they will learn something today. And God, those who aren't with us for whatever reason, be with them. Help us always see where we can help and serve in whatever capacity we can. Be with those who are dealing with sicknesses and losses, and God, be with them in this time. Help us always do the right thing.
Amen. Thank you. So we kind of learn here through 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John a lot about what John's dealing with here. John is dealing with kind of the church here at the end of the 1st century. It's kind of why he wrote these things. There are some disruptive people here. There are some troublemakers, really, who have become involved in the church. And these people eventually leave the church, that we're going to read about that here, but they do still do a lot of harm. They spread a lot of disharmony among the brethren. It just becomes a real issue. And the main issue that John is kind of dealing with is this belief of Gnosticism. We're going to get into a little bit more about Gnosticism a little later this morning. But it's really becoming prevalent. And that's what John is dealing with. It's what John's teaching against here in these letters. And what you kind of see here really is kind of interesting. You see the principle that maybe you've heard of this, the Rehoboam principle. The Rehoboam principle, which is, if you look back in the Old Testament, you had these generations. Of course, you had David. David was this very faithful man of God. His son Solomon, he started out pretty good, but then kind of in the waning years, started going downhill with his spirituality. And then, of course, you got to the last generation of Rehoboam, the grandson. Rehoboam, you see the spirituality of the nation of Israel there really took a nosedive, that 3rd generation. And I think you kind of see some principle apply here. Before we get in that, what years did you have as the writings of 1 John? Where did y'all see when was 1 John written?
85 to 90 AD.
85 to 90? Yeah, it was getting pretty late. And so how old did this make John? Yeah, he was getting pretty up there in age. Pretty old. He was at least 80, 90 years old. I mean, he was certainly becoming an aged man. And so what I think you see here is we're dealing with this 3rd generation of people. We had kind of the original Christians who walked with Christ back in Acts chapter 2. But now we're having children. Now we're having grandchildren by this time. And so you're seeing this false teaching. You're seeing this belief of Gnosticism. And John is here kind of dealing with that and speaking to that. It's easy to say it's only been about 60 years since Jesus was on this earth, but just think about how much things change in 60 years. Things change a lot in 60 years. We were at the Kentucky football game last night, and I was wanting to show Maddie Sue kind of the differences in the scoreboard between last night and one of the first games I went to. Well, of course, now the scoreboards in both end zones are just these ginormous TVs, right? I mean, that's all they are. You can put anything on them. I mean, all kinds of graphics, videos. I mean, they're just showing stuff all the time. I mean, it's just amazing, ginormous TVs. So I showed her the one from the game I went to in 1997. Now that's only 26, 27 years ago. I mean, that's less than half of 60 years. It is this board that's painted on. It's all painted, except where the score is light bulbs that you can change, where you can change the score. I mean, that is amazing how different that is. Just think about how much things change over time. You say only 60 years. It doesn't seem like maybe that much, but things really change a lot over time. And so I think you see that here. How many apostles, when 1 John is written and when we're talking about here, how many apostles are there left on the earth?
They think John might be the last one.
Pretty sure John was the last one at this time. Yeah, John was it. John was the last one here. Well, why do you think he got to live longer than the other apostles?
Better genes.
Do what? Better genes. Okay. John had good genes. Anybody else have a more relevant answer?
Get Revelation, because John had this vision.
Okay.
There's probably some providence in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly we talked about, when we were talking about Peter back in John chapter 21, when Jesus tells Peter that, how he's going to die and all of that. And there's kind of the question there, well, what about John? What's going to happen there? And I think you kind of say, well, he's going to have to stay. And I think we see why in this book. He was left to share with us this message of probably the last 3 books that were written. Depending on how you date Revelation, this could be the very 3 last books written in the New Testament. We're not going to get into how we're going to date Revelation in this class. You can save that for the next Revelation class. But we're certainly towards the end. We're certainly towards the very end, either way. And so you see that, and he's left to deal with these people who are really starting to deny the deity of Christ. It's kind of one of the big things that Gnostics taught. So John is here dealing with that. And kind of what you see here is this older man who's full of wisdom, but he's dealing with a very serious topic. People are really struggling here with this Gnostics and the Gnosticism, and John has been left to kind of help them get through that and get them through it. I think it's interesting if you kind of look back historically through this. John did a lot of good here. Gnosticism was something that when it first came on the scene, it really took off. It really became prevalent. There were a lot of people that started following it. But kind of after John stayed here and dealt with it, it really died down. I'm not saying it went away. I don't think you see that. But as far as from the explosion at the beginning, it really died down. John had a great effect on dying this teaching down and getting it down some. And so you see that his efforts before he died here did a lot of good with the Christians there. Gnosticism really blew up, but John dealt it a pretty good blow. And so the book of John, it's kind of interesting. It's referred to as a letter, but it doesn't really look like or read like a letter. It doesn't have kind of the typical introduction of a letter. It doesn't have a salutation. It doesn't really have a sign-off. It's like it's not really even a letter. It's more like a sermon. It's more like this written down sermon that John has left with the people here. So that's kind of interesting. I think it's widely believed that these letters were distributed to several different churches. Not just one, but it was sent to many different churches for Christians to read. I think one that it was certainly sent to was the church at Ephesus. It was reported that John had been living here kind of at this time. And so that certainly makes a lot of sense. So it went to a lot of churches, but it certainly went to Ephesus. In chapter 2, verse 1, John does address the group here as little children. Why do you think he calls them little children there in chapter 2, verse 1?
Compared to him, they may have been young in the faith.
Okay, could have been young in the faith. I think they were certainly struggling a little bit. I think they were a fairly close group. I think they knew each other well, and so I think it was a little bit of a term of an endearment. We've kind of seen that a lot of times from these writers in these classes, that they would call them these names of endearment to kind of let them know, hey, we really do care for you. We really do love you. We want the best for you. I think that's kind of what you see there with John addressing them as little children.
Didn't Paul refer to Timothy as his son?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Just the older, John being older.
correct.
Your point about endearment.
Yep, for sure, absolutely. Yep. And to kind of go back to the point of, that this letters went to Ephesus, if you try that together with a little bit, do you remember when John was writing to Revelation, what was his complaint to the church there in Ephesus? You remember that? Ephesus, they had lost their first love. Yeah, that was the complaint that he had against them. And so what you kind of see here in 1 John is a group of Christians who not only lost the love for the Lord, but they lost, in some ways, the love for one another. And John addresses that with these brethren here in this book. So themes in the book. What do you see as kind of the theme of 1 John?
Love.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Love.
Yeah, love. Love is absolutely the number one theme that John addresses there. 1 John 3:23. You certainly see it talked about there and a lot of other places. I think love is the main theme for sure. Might be a couple of others. He may also have anything different.
My intro says God is life, God is life. But it falls right in with God is love. So.
Yeah, I think certainly God is love is the most important one, but I think God is light is probably the second one. He talks a lot about light and darkness. And the reason that he had to talk a lot about light and darkness was the belief that Gnostics had about darkness. Gnostics believed certainly that God even had a dark side. And so they were teaching that to the people there. They certainly believed that our human body was full of sin and was full of darkness. And so this was something that the Gnostics were teaching during this time. This was something that John had to address here. So John was constantly talking about love, but he was also talking a lot about light and darkness. Trying to tell the people that all is not darkness. God is nothing but light. He says, in your bodies, that you have to change, that you have to be different. Yes, there is sin, and sin brings darkness. It brings separation, but there's also light. There is a changing and a turning towards the light. And so John addresses that here in the book. And so I think you see these three. Love being the first, but you also see light and darkness. In verse 4, 1 John 1 and verse 4, I think you see there why he's writing this book. It says there, so your joy may be complete. People during this time were really struggling with understanding the fellowship and the joy that is in the Lord. 1 John 2 and verse 1, you see the same thought, the same verbiage. I'm writing these to you so that you may not sin. Chapter 2, verse 26, I write these things to you about those who are trying to deceive you. And so you see John here concentrating on false teachers. Get these false teachers out of your life. Get back into the Word. Get back into each other, into church. Get the joy that you once had back. Get the love that you once had for each other and for the Word back. We've got to get these Gnostics and false teachers out of here. And that's what John is talking about. That's why he wrote this letter here. Again, in chapter 5, verse 13, you see, I write these things to you so that you will believe in the name of the Son of God. John going back to this idea of Jesus being deity. Not even that they would know it or believe it, but they would have confidence in it. That they would be assured of it. They would be assured of Jesus being deity, assured of their salvation. So I think that is some of the reasons that John wrote this, some of the things they were struggling with, some of the things they were talking about there. So, that is a kind of a brief introduction to 1 John. As I said, we're going to try to move through things a little bit faster. So if somebody would, read verses 1 through 4. 1 through 4, 1 John chapter 1.
That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testified to it, and proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us, and indeed our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ. And we are writing these things so that our joy may be complete.
Okay, that's quite the run-on sentence that he begins this book with there. But what's the point he's trying to make here? Well, the people are starting to say, I don't believe in Jesus. I don't know that Jesus was who he said he was. And John is saying here, well, you know what? I've seen him. I've heard him. I've touched him. I know who he is. He's also pointing out here that Jesus was in the flesh, but he was also deity. And so that kind of gets us to Gnosticism. This idea of Gnosticism, which was a prevalent, a predominant thought kind of during the day. What is your all's definition of Gnosticism? What do you see as Gnosticism? Yeah, they claim superior knowledge, especially concerning religious matters, or especially concerning God. Gnostics just thought that they were above everybody, that they had this knowledge that was given to them, and it was above everybody, and they were above sin, they were above God, they were above everything because of the knowledge that they possessed. And John's going to kind of come back at them a little bit here and say, well, where did that come from? Because I'm an apostle. I knew Jesus. Like, I touched him. I felt him. I knew all about him. So where are you getting off that you have superior knowledge? Clearly you don't have superior knowledge. You don't have that. We talked about this. Gnostics also saw the body, the human physical body, as just being pure darkness. It was always pure darkness. It was always full of sin. That's kind of how they thought that. And if you think about that, if you think about that our body is just constantly dark, it's just constantly full of sin, well, what does that do to your mindset? What does that do to your view of spirituality? If that is just your constant belief.
Well, with the Gnosticism, what it does is it allows them to engage in any type of sinful activity because that's just what the body is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they do that
Exactly.
without any regret or sorrow or guilt or anything because their thought is this is what the body does, but the inward spirit is pure.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it can be so discouraging to try to live that way. Look at 1 John 2. 1 John 2, 8 and 9. Somebody read that. 1 John 2, 8 and 9.
Again, a new commandment I write unto you, which thing is true in him and in you, because the darkness is past and the true light now shineth. He that saith he is in the light and hateth his brother is in darkness even until now.
Yeah, so what I think you see here is just direct opposition to what the Gnostics were teaching. Right? This is direct contrast to this teaching of darkness that they had. There should be great light in us. We see that throughout the New Testament. Our bodies should not be nothing but sin. Our bodies should not be nothing but darkness. They should be transformed through Jesus Christ, right? Jesus Christ changes us. It changes who we are. We are to have light. And so I think we see the false teaching there that Gnostics had, and John addressing it. So we're going to talk a lot in John throughout this book about Jesus being the Christ, Jesus being the Son of God. You know, everything that Jesus does for us, everything that he has done for us. And because of that, what is our responsibility towards him? What is our responsibility towards him? And the first of that being that we should love one another. We should love one another. Listening to John, you just kind of see this older gentleman. He's kind of got a Galilean accent. He certainly does not have a strong education as far as the world sees strong education. He's probably not using big, profound words here. But when you really start to dig into this, when you really start to read it and you listen to it, he gets deep. He gets into some deep topics, some deep discussions. And I think that's an amazing thing. And even in these first 10 verses, you just see amazing, powerful insights into the character of God and in the character of our Father. One of the amazing things that he points us out is that we can have a relationship with Jesus just as John did. Here's John, this apostle who talked to Jesus, touched Jesus, saw Jesus. And he's telling these people, you can have the same kind of relationship with Jesus that I do. That is possible. So let's embrace that. And so we see three attributes here of who Jesus and God are. We see God as life, we see God as light, we see God as love. And all those speak to kind of God's character and who he is. So that kind of finishes up first four verses. So if somebody would, let's read verses 5 through 10. Verses 5 through 10, 1 John 1.
This is the message we have heard from him and proclaim to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. If we say we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us.
What is spiritual light? How would you define that? What is spiritual light? It's purity. It is goodness. It is sinlessness. It is righteousness. And it's holiness. If we are trying to have a relationship with the Father in the light, well, we're trying to practice being sinless, right? I mean, that's our goal. That's what we're working towards. But of course, we know we do have sin, right? That does happen. And this was such an issue because the Gnostics believed that they had reached such a strong knowledge and such a strong spiritual knowledge that they no longer sinned. They no longer had any sin. They were kind of above sin. And certainly that God had, they also taught that God had a side of light and a side of darkness. But John here makes it very clear that God is only light and there is no darkness in him. Look at James 1:17. Yeah, so we see in this verse and we see in 1 John, there is no darkness in God. He is all light. He is all good things. Every good thing that we have, any good thing that comes is from God. I think 3 times here you see John use this phrase, if we say. If we say. Verse 6, if we say we have a great relationship with the Father, but our lifestyle is something different, then we are a liar. That's kind of the first if we say. Verse 8, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. That's second. In verse 10, if we say we have not sinned, do you think this is saying here in verse 10 that we have never sinned? No, I mean, I don't think so either. But apparently this was something else that was being said by the Gnostics, and it was confusing the brethren. Because if you say that, well, what are you saying?
Like Jesus.
Yeah, and you're calling God a liar if you're saying you're not sin. Basically, what John is saying here in these points that he's making, it doesn't matter what you say. What you say is not relevant. It's not important. What matters is what you can do. You can say anything, right? We understand that principle. We can say anything. What's important is what we actually go out and do and the way we live our lives. Verse 9, if we confess our sins, He is faithful to forgive our sins. And I think what you see here in verse 9, I just see something so powerful about the personal pronoun that John uses here in verse 9. What's the personal pronoun that he uses there? So it's ours and yours? I think in mine it is. Yeah, which would be the same. So who does that include? Yeah, it includes himself. Absolutely. John includes himself in that. I think that's so powerful. He's speaking of himself. He says, look, I have this incredible relationship with Jesus. But you know what else? I confess my sins. I'm an apostle, but I confess my sins. What he's saying here, we've all sinned. We've all fallen short. Nobody has a sinless life. And this includes me. This includes John. What confidence, what comfort that should give us in that. I think what you want... Somebody going to say something? Sorry. I think what we also see here is that we have a responsibility in this relationship. Right? We have things that we're responsible for. We have things that we have to do. We have to come in contact with the blood of Christ, right? I mean, that is our responsibility. We have to confess our sins. We have to be obedient. We have to live a life of obedience. These things were written for us. So John is speaking to us here as kind of the beloved disciple who says, read what is written. Let it dwell within you. This is your guide. This is from God who is light. And he goes on, he says, trust it. Trust what is written. Love God. Keep His commandments. Do all these things. So that kind of brings an end to chapter 1. Anybody else have anything they wanted to add to that or say to that?
I mean, if he's 85, 90 years old, still saying our sins, you know.
Pretty powerful.
Well, yeah, he's still immune, he's not immune to being sinful at his advanced age. Recognizing that.
Right. And the realization of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's so powerful. So true. Very true.
Well, if we say that we've not sinned, we're trying to make ourselves perfect like Jesus is. And we can't do that.
Exactly. Yeah. We can't do that. We are not there. We've all fallen short. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, somebody read 1 John chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. 1 John chapter 2, 1 through 6.
My little children, these things I write to you, so that you may not sin. And then if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. And He Himself is a propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the whole world. Now, by this we know that we know Him, if we keep His commandments. He who says, I know Him, and does not keep His commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps His word, truly the love of God is perfected in him. By this says he abides in him, ought himself also to walk just as he walked.
I think it's kind of interesting. This is now the second time. It's kind of the second time now that we've seen here in 1 John that John says, if you're doing this or you're saying this, then you're a liar. You're not. The truth is not in you. John is saying quite powerfully, quite actually out there, that sin is out there, and that we have to be careful about sinning. Certainly, there are things that Christ has done for us, but if someone is out there telling you that you cannot sin, you better be careful of that. Know that is not true teaching, and that is not pure teaching. At the end of chapter 1, he's saying, if you say you've not sinned, well, then we make him a liar. But now here in chapter 2, he's saying, well, if we know him, but we don't follow his commandments, then we're the liar, right? We are the liar there. So then he goes on here in these first 5 verses, and he gives us kind of a list of these do nots. 5 things in the first 5 verses that he says, do not do. He says, do not sin. It's very plain. Kind of very plain talking. Kind of like talking to your kid. Just be very plain. Do not sin. But then number 2, he says, but if you do sin, don't fret about it. Don't fret about it. Why? Why are we not going to fret about our sin?
God sent Jesus to forgive us.
Yeah, God sent Jesus to forgive us. We have an advocate, right? He uses that word advocate here. We have Jesus. We have the advocate. 3, do not fail to share this with the world. He's saying go out into all the world. Why all the world? Well, Jesus died for all the world, right? He died for everybody. So go out into the world and teach it. Don't fail to do that. Number 4, he says, don't relax at keeping commandments. Keep the commandments. Be obedient. And number 5, don't doubt his love. Don't doubt his love. I feel like we live in a world that is very, very confused about a lot of things religiously. But I think even among that, certainly they're confused about sin. And you see here kind of a great example of that, because you see here people who were sinning, and they were so concerned about that sin because they didn't understand this idea of having Jesus as the advocate. It was so concerning to them. But you see the exact opposite there. You had these people who just kept on sinning, just kept on going, kept on doing it, because they felt like that the sin had been covered and that they could just go on and do whatever they wanted to without worrying about it. And I think you see that so much in today's world, that the people, they follow false teachings and don't study themselves, and they don't put any effort into it, and they just eventually come to this conclusion, well, how are you just ever going to know? I mean, there's just so much here. You're never going to be able to figure out. You're never going to be able to know it. How are you ever going to know it? So let's just, it just is what it is, and let's just move on. And I think this was hard. It's hard today. I think it was hard during this time, because the Gnostics were in there, and they were casting their doubts on everything. They were spreading their false teaching. They were saying that God and Jesus weren't who they said they were, and it was just constant and on, and just trying to build up doubt in the people that they were teaching there to.
Well, do you think that deep down that they knew better, or they just didn't want to try to
Ye-
stay with him?
Yeah, I think for sure they knew better. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of the story of the whole Christian life. I mean, we all know better. Like the children of Israel always knew better. When we sin, we know better. We all struggle with that, and certainly people here struggled with it as well, for sure.
Apparently, this problem of man desiring to hide his sins was probably from the beginning. Well, it was from the beginning, because Adam and Eve tried to hide their sin.
Yeah.
But Proverbs 28:13 says, "He that covereth his sin shall not prosper, but whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy." So, that was a lesson that was needed throughout the ages, apparently. That, yes, man is going to sin, but in order to be forsake them.
Absolutely.
Which is part of confession, not only making them known, but putting them behind you and living differently from then on.
Yep. Absolutely. For
When-
sure.
When John talks about, sin, darkness, and light, and stuff like that, that's the importance of confession. Things that we struggle with, whatever it is. Once you confess that and bring that into the light, it takes the power of that sin away. Especially when you can, you've got people in the church, that's gonna help you, and keep tabs with you. Be like, hey, how you doing today? You can't say, hey, I need forgiveness and leave it at that. I mean, it's gonna take work. And I think once you bring it out of the darkness into the light, that's a big step
Yeah.
in that.
Absolutely. Great point. Certainly what John's saying here. Absolutely. Yes. To your point, what does light do? It shows a way. It provides a path. 1 John 1, verse 5, God is light. Verse 7, if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. 1 John 2, 8, 9, and 10, John once again takes us back to this idea of light. What John is really trying to, I think, explain here, what he's really trying to say is, how do you walk in the light? Like, you need to walk in the light, but how does this really look? Like, what does this look like when you're really doing it? Here's how you do it. First off, you don't sin, right? You don't do that. But secondly, if you do, don't fret about it. The Lord is there with you. He's your advocate. Don't fail to share it with others, right? Preach the word. Teach it. Don't fail to do that. Obey the commandments. And don't doubt His love. Don't ever doubt Jesus. Don't ever doubt God. That's how you walk in the light. That's what walking in the light looks like, right? Stay away from sin. But if you do, know that you have the advocate. The Lord is with you. Teach others. Obey the commandments. And don't doubt God. Don't doubt Jesus. They are there with you. They are there for you. That's how you walk in the light. That's what it looks like when you do that. So what is your definition of advocate? What is an advocate? It's a go-between, okay? A go-between for what?
Well, it could be for a lot of things.
Okay? Be for a lot of things, yeah. I think another definition is helper. I think kind of interesting if you look at it from a kind of a perspective of court of law. Somebody takes you to court and they accuse you of something, and you're sitting there, you're in front of the judge, and then you have people coming in to argue your side, right? You have people bringing in, they're arguing their side. They're saying what they need to say about you. Who's our advocate? Who's our greatest arguer? Certainly Jesus. So that brings up an interesting question. What kind of advocacy is He going to provide? I mean, does He stand up and say, well, Darren didn't really commit that sin? Is that what Jesus is doing when He is our advocate? Is He standing up and saying, Darren didn't do that? Yeah.
Kind of how I just think about it is, he was God and man when he was here on earth. He felt and experienced and saw everything that we do. And I would think then, when he's talking to his Father, he can explain that.
I love it. That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. There is literally nobody who could be a better advocate for us than Jesus. Right? I mean, He came and He lived here. He experienced everything we've experienced. Yet there He is sitting at the right hand of God. And so, no, I'm with you. I don't think He goes up there and says, I don't think Darren really did that. We kind of pushed that under the rug and all was good. I think what He does try to say is, yes, Darren made a mistake, but he repented of that. He's put that behind him. He is walking in the light. He's doing the best he can. He's growing, and he's trying to work really hard and to get better. I mean, I think this is kind of the advocacy, kind of the trying to plead with God that hey, no, he's not perfect, but here's what's going on. And I think you summed that up beautifully.
I think you had a good point there too, Darren. Like, he's doing the best he can. The best you can, the best I can, the best this person can be a totally different thing. I think about a guy Megan and I used to go to church with in Nashville. You never knew what he was going to say when he got up in front of the church. Sometimes people would be like, "Oh boy, what's Bob going to say today?" And Bob had a very traumatic Vietnam experience, but he was a very faithful man, had his own struggles. But when I think about stuff like that, like his best he could, best I could, it might look different to us, but God knows, our heart and what we are trying to do as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that is why we need the advocate, and why that is so important.
Someone Christ advocacy is also whatever he owes, I've paid it. And I think that's the thing we always have to remember, that his sacrifice is a huge part of his advocacy for us.
Yeah. And I think that's our part in it, is doing the best we can, trying every day to walk in the light, trying to grow and get better. And that's what we talked about in this class. That's our part of this relationship of the advocacy, as Jesus is before God, arguing for us. Man, we better be here doing the best we can, so he can make that argument and make it stick. Thank you.
Earn it so we can honor it.
Correct. Yeah, there's certainly no earning, but we're just down here sinning all the time. I mean, it's kind of a pointless deal. Thank you all very much. We will pick up there Wednesday.